Well, since it is 10 o'clock, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. This is a presentation about NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. My name is Tyler Swinney. I am the NAGPRA coordinator, the tribal liaison, and archaeology collections manager at the Cincinnati Museum Center. This presentation has three parts. First, it will provide a basic introduction to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which is more commonly referred to as NAGPRA. The second part will address the museum's primary NAGPRA goals, and we'll also discuss some of the challenges that we have faced or encounter while implementing our NAGPRA program. And then the third part will briefly explore how building relationships with descendant communities can have mutually beneficial impacts that go beyond NAGPRA. So without further ado, let's get started. NAGPRA. It's federal legislation that provides a process for federal agencies and institutions that receive federal funding to return certain cultural objects and human remains to lineal descendants, federally recognized tribes, as well as Native Alaskan and Hawaiian organizations. There are many misconceptions that revolve around NAGPRA, hence this presentation is intended to be a practical introduction to help clarify some of the many uncertainties. NAGPRA not only establishes rights for descendant communities and provides definitions for identification, protection, and repatriation of cultural resources, but it also authorizes federal grants to assist documentation and consultation, enables a review committee to monitor the NAGPRA process and resolve disputes, as well as establishes civil penalties to enforce institutional compliance, and criminalizes illegal trafficking of Native human remains and cultural items as a felony offense. Congress enacted NAGPRA as a mechanism to right historical injustices and address disparities between Native groups, the U.S. government, and institutional officials that oversee collections that contain human remains and NAGPRA items. Even though NAGPRA deals with issues of property, it was designed to benefit groups suffering discrimination, including Native American sovereign nations and lineal descendants of Indigenous Americans, including Native Alaskan organizations and Native Hawaiian organizations. It is imperative to view NAGPRA as a piece of human rights legislation. NAGPRA's final ruling in 2010 for culturally unidentified remains furthers the human rights goals of the original legislation while fully recognizing the positive and negative history of Native and Euro-American interactions. It is important to acknowledge the present and past sovereignty of tribal nations because a balance between cultural sensitivity, respect, and scientific integrity must be maintained to decolonize archaeological and museum policies to regain the trust of descendant communities. Jurisdiction is an important aspect of NAGPRA because it defines who must participate in a variety of compliance activities. Simply put, any organization that has accepted federal funds after 1990 and is in possession of NAGPRA objects or Native human remains must comply with NAGPRA. Similarly, any institution that wishes to apply for federal funding in the future must also be in compliance with NAGPRA or risks exposure to civil penalties for noncompliance. NAGPRA applies to human remains and cultural items that meet specific criteria. These include items that serve the funerary function or have ongoing sacred, ceremonial, historical, traditional, or cultural importance. The statute defines items that fall under the purview of NAGPRA in Section 6. There are a lot of confusing components to Section 2. There are a lot of confusing components to this section. The number one thing that I run into when talking to the general public about NAGPRA is that essentially everything is defined as a museum. So that would include libraries, universities, technical institutions. So either agencies or museums are the two main classifications in NAGPRA. It's important to stress that NAGPRA makes no distinction between complete burials, disarticulated burials, cremations, or isolated bones or teeth. In reality, human remains are one of the few things that are not actually defined in NAGPRA, as it was assumed that their meaning would be clear. Some Native Americans attached human hair to items such as shirts, leggings, or pouches, and in some instances, used human hair to make thread or containers. Also be mindful that some items incorporating human remains can have sacred or religious meaning, and that some indigenous groups removed human remains from slain enemies, such as scalps, fingers, and teeth. Sometimes these items were incorporated into a variety of objects. Objects that incorporate human remains that were not willingly given would fall under the scope of NAGPRA. In most cases, the human remains interred with unassociated funerary objects are no longer in the possession or control of the federal agency or museum. Sometimes, both may be in control of the organization, but contextual data has been lost and cannot be linked to specific sets of remains. Funerary objects can be pretty much anything, and it may not necessarily be easily identifiable unless you're participating in the cultural network from which they were originally interred. So it's important to remember that funerary objects need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis using all of the available excavation notes, photographs, and data. Although religious freedom is an important component of American ideology, Native American religious freedom was not possible until 1978. This was with the passing of the Native American Religious Freedom Act. NAGPRA recognizes the legacy of Native American religious suppression and authorizes Native American religious leaders to identify objects that are needed for traditional ceremonies and have been separated from the rightful owners. These items are defined as sacred objects in NAGPRA and include both the use of the objects in ceremonies currently conducted by traditional practitioners and instances where the objects are needed to renew ceremonies that are part of a traditional religion. Objects of cultural patrimony are perhaps the most difficult category of NAGPRA items to recognize and are best identified by elders or leaders who actively participate in the community that the item holds ongoing central importance. Generally speaking, these items are considered communal property and were usually alienated from the tribe or group by an individual who was not authorized to act alone in parting with this particular item. Items of cultural patrimony cannot be retroactively designated communal property in the past and do not necessarily include personal property of famous chiefs, historical figures, or anyone else who may have conveyed those items away from those individuals initially. NAGPRA requires federal agencies and museums to share information about collections that are potentially affiliated with federally recognized tribes. Because the majority of museum personnel are not qualified to identify sacred objects or objects of cultural patrimony, most summaries are simply letters that summarize the contents of specific collections and invite further consultation with potentially affiliated descendant communities. Summaries can be thought of as the first step in the NAGPRA notification protocol and are designed to notify federally recognized tribes of collections that require further investigation through consultation. Inventories are essentially detailed lists of information about human remains and funerary objects that are ultimately submitted to the National NAGPRA program as determining documents that comprehensively outline a collection's contents and cultural associations. Consultation means the sharing of summarized information between federal agencies and museums with authorized representatives of federally recognized descendant communities. Consultations offer important opportunities to not only assist tribes with implementing the NAGPRA process, but also allow museums to learn more about their collections, correct information in their records, and expand their understanding of items in cultural settings through the exchange of traditional cultural knowledge. Consultation should be viewed as an opportunity to meet on equal terms, and accessibility to decision makers and leaders on both sides should be facilitated as much as possible to accomplish set goals. Consultations do not necessarily need to occur in person, and rewarding outcomes can also be accomplished through Skype, phone meetings, or through email. Ideally, consultation means an exchange of opinions, ideas, and interpretations. It is important for museums and federal agencies to make relative collection records and excavation documentation available to assist tribal representatives in determining if items meet NAGPRA definitions and whether there is interest to formally submit a claim. Consultation visits are also important to both parties, as they not only provide descendant communities with a more holistic understanding of collections and their origins, but they also afford occasions for meaningful dialogue about mutually important issues in addition to NAGPRA, such as education, exhibition, security and accessibility, as well as culturally appropriate collection management. Generally speaking, a good consultation includes activities such as examining predetermined collections of interest, usually object by object, sharing appropriate documentation about each individual object, and discussing NAGPRA significance and applicability to specific items and collections. NAGPRA gives museums and federal agencies the sole responsibility and authority to make findings of cultural affiliation for Native human remains and cultural items that are reasonably based on the entirety of available evidence. Museums and federal agencies' cultural affiliation determinations should not be viewed they should be viewed as flexible constructs and not specific determining documents, determining ideas. Museum and federal agencies are dependent upon available evidence. The cultural determinations are dependent upon available evidence and may change through information sharing or as additional archaeological, historic, or ethnographic evidence comes to light. Shared group identity is usually met by showing that the historic tribe or tribes are directly ancestral to the claimant tribe. This is usually supported by showing discrete patterns of material culture or by establishing a group as a biologically distinct population. Historic and geographic evidence, as well as archaeological classification systems, are useful in setting forth earlier groups that can potentially extend many centuries into the past. While tracing linkages between descendant communities and archaeological groups, gaps in the connections should not be used to deny or discredit cultural affiliation, but may indicate multi-ethnicity and that multiple descendant communities could be related. When more than one community is affiliated with NAGPRA items, it is necessary for all culturally affiliated groups to have an opportunity to participate in a joint repatriation claim. The term disposition recognizes the culturally unidentifiable human remains may not be affiliated to the federally recognized communities that have agreed to act as caretakers. It's also important to remember that repatriation does not necessarily mean destruction. This is especially true for unassociated funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony, as these can be considered as tangible connections to a tribal nation's culture and history. These items can potentially be used to reinforce group identity through traditional religions, ceremonies, exhibition, and education. In the vast majority of cases, tribal nations prefer that repatriation or disposition of human remains and NAGPRA objects be as close as possible to the geographic location from which they originated. That poses difficulties in Ohio due to our unmarked burial laws, which are woefully inadequate. A claim is a formal written request by a federally recognized tribe or Native Alaskan or Hawaiian organization requesting the return of NAGPRA objects or human remains. Successful claims are usually collaborative efforts and must address three primary issues. First, they must demonstrate the claimed item is affiliated with the claimant tribe. Second, they must provide evidence that the claimed items meet the definitions of one or more NAGPRA object categories. And third, in the case of funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony, evidence must be provided that reasonably challenges the institution's right of possession of that particular object. A preponderance of the evidence must be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. This is often accomplished through a cultural affiliation report, which the claiming organization will provide to the museum or federal agency in control of NAGPRA objects. However, a cultural affiliation report is not necessary for human remains, as procedures were established in NAGPRA's final ruling of 2010 to resolve the disposition of outstanding culturally unidentifiable human remains in collections across the country. Throughout the entirety of the claim process, each party assumes specific responsibilities. For museums and federal agencies, the first responsibilities are to identify and accurately summarize NAGPRA collections, as well as notify all descendant communities that are affiliated or potentially affiliated to those collections. Following the notification protocol, institutions must begin to compile appropriate inventories and should work toward accomplishing 100% accountability of NAGPRA items included in each collection. During the inventory process, museums and federal agencies should have regular correspondence with interested descendant communities and must prepare for in-person or remote consultations with all interested parties by making salient information reasonably available upon request. For descendant communities, the principal responsibilities revolve around, first, determining if the collections are covered under NAGPRA. Second, identifying if museums or federal agencies have clear title and right of possession. Of course, excluding human remains in this case. And third, researching evidence needed to sustain a repatriation claim or repatriation report. Although the process of claim preparation, submission, and evaluation can be quite arduous, the NAGPRA claim process ensures that the interest of all potential parties can be protected and asserted. For museums in particular, it's important to consider the interconnectedness of NAGPRA and fiduciary responsibilities. If the fiduciary responsibility of a museum is to acquire and interpret historical and cultural items for the benefit of the public, is it a conflict of interest to engage in activities that can result in the loss of significant objects? In this regard, when thinking about NAGPRA, I find that it is most important to consider what is gained through meaningful consultations and relationships established with descendant communities rather than dwell on what is lost. In my opinion, the long-term rewards are far more numerous and than it is to dwell on the items that might be lost during the repatriation process, and it's not a fiduciary responsibility or duty of any museum to oppose, ignore, or undermine legislation that is overwhelmingly supported by the museum community, passed by Congress, and signed into law. So that's a basic introduction to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. I realize that NAGPRA can be confusing because it has bogged down with an abundance of legal jargon and definitions. So I found that these resources in particular are very useful for deciphering NAGPRA, and I often reference them whenever I have a question or I need a refresher in any specific instance. There's going to be a couple of these question slides throughout the remainder of the presentation, so I think it's probably best to wait towards the end to address any particular questions. So for right now, we'll move on to the second part. No two NAGPRA programs are the same, and each institution or agency has unique collections that require their own set of solutions. Although NAGPRA compliance often involves difficult conversations and decisions, in my experience, most of the things that are genuinely worth completing in life involve some level of difficulty or discomfort. At CMC, we've had 3 primary NAGPRA goals since the beginning of our program. First was to verify and document all human remains and potential associated funerary objects in archaeology collections by conducting a complete re-inventory, rehabilitation of storage, excavation and collection record digitization project, and improvement of curation storage practices. Second was to pursue tribal consultation with appropriate descendant communities. And third was eventual repatriation of all NAGPRA collections as agreed upon by affiliated tribal partners. Early on in our NAGPRA program, it became apparent that we needed to devise a strategic plan to accomplish our goals. This slide summarizes the 4 main foci of the strategic plan: funding, consultation, improving inventory accuracy, and repatriation. As would be expected, identifying and obtaining consistent funding to support our consultation and documentation efforts was a major priority. We have been fortunate. We're the only institution in Ohio to receive 3 consecutive NAGPRA grants, hence it's imperative to state that the Museum Center's NAGPRA work would not be possible without the generous funding for salaries, travel expenses, and supplies that are provided through federal NAGPRA grants. One primary goal of our NAGPRA program is to verify Cincinnati Museum Center's inventories. During the fall of 2016, a campaign was initiated to compare National NAGPRA's culturally unidentifiable Native American inventory database to the museum's initial 1996 NAGPRA inventory and current collections. This effort is ongoing, and it involves both a physical inventory and document search. We've had numerous challenges in executing this goal. For instance, the culturally unidentifiable inventory database records did not exactly match our inventories, and the majority of excavated NAGPRA collections within the museum's control were not actually entered into our collections management software. This hindered our ability to quickly draw upon records and to check relational information amongst some of the collections that have similar components. Even though most burials were swiftly located, it was quickly identified that there were a few boxes of skeletal material that were never thoroughly inventoried because the provenience data was uncertain. Similar issues affect any skeletal material that was ever used in research, exhibited, or pulled for type collections. To make matters more difficult, the museum's extensive faunal collections had never been assessed for undocumented or miscatalogued human remains. Many of these complications we attributed to the fact that most of the skeletal remains in the museum's control were initially inventoried and curated by outside institutions. Most notably were Indiana University and the University of Cincinnati, where Native American skeletal remains were used in human osteology classes in addition to being researched. It wasn't until the mid-1990s that the burials housed at UC were transferred back to the Cincinnati Museum Center. This helps to explain why so many of the museum's NAGPRA holdings were never entered into our collections management databases, as the primary effort to digitize collections was in the early and into the middle 1990s. With the identification of this many issues at the onset of our program, it became apparent that Cincinnati Museum Center's entire archaeology collection required assessment, and that all faunal collections that may potentially contain human remains needed to be re-inventoried if we were ever going to ensure or achieve 100% accountability of NAGPRA objects in our control. Another principal goal of our NAGPRA work is to proactively engage in the consultation process with all tribes that may be potentially affiliated to NAGPRA holdings in our control. Multiple tribes can have claims to our collections, and we realize that they do not all share the same beliefs and practices about how NAGPRA objects should be stored, handled, or repatriated. Face-to-face dialogue and cooperative information sharing is a fundamental component of the NAGPRA process that not only assists tribes and museums to determine which cultural items fall under the purview of NAGPRA, but also provides an important opportunity for us to use tribal feedback to better interpret and understand the cultural settings from which the Museum Center's collections originated. However, building and maintaining relationships is not necessarily inherent, and it is now obvious to us that relationships must be actively pursued and maintained. Although we've learned many important lessons during the consultation process, perhaps the most important are that one tribe does not necessarily speak for another, and that meaningful dialogue about NAGPRA issues can take many different forms. That being said, tribal consultation comes with some challenges. For instance, identifying the correct tribes to consult was not as easy as anticipated due to a lack of ethno-historical documentation for our region and the demographic catastrophes and social disruptions associated with American colonization. We learned early on that there are as many as 47 Algonquian, Siouan, and Iroquoian tribes with potential claims to the Cincinnati Museum Center's NAGPRA holdings. Hence, we anticipate that it will take several years to complete these consultations through a number of grant-funded projects. NAGPRA is humbling and has institutional impact far beyond compiling inventories or deaccessioning collections. It is important to embrace NAGPRA, not only as a mechanism for federal agencies and institutions that receive federal funding to do the right thing, return human remains and cultural objects to affiliated descendant communities, but also as an instrument to identify mutual interests, cultivate relationships, and improve collections management policies. Perhaps the biggest lesson we have learned is that NAGPRA is a people project, and that investing in relationships and the importance of partnerships, transparency, and collaboration cannot be stressed enough. Similarly, being flexible and receptive to the advice of all tribal representatives are requisites to a successful NAGPRA program. Truthfully, NAGPRA requires cooperation and partnerships to identify creative solutions for complex and difficult issues. Investing in people by building relationships is the approach that we take, as we believe that consultation should aim at building a dialogue based upon the mutual respect and dignity that all people deserve. That is why we have actively pursued consultation over the past few years, as respect for the dignity of all people, including the individuals stewarded by Cincinnati Museum Center, is unfortunately not an ideal that we see enough of in today's modern world. Simply put, tribal relationships and consultations are key. It takes persistence and patience to establish, build, and maintain working relationships. As a museum with substantial Native American collections, we recognize the past imbalances between tribal sovereigns and museum officials. However, we believe that through consultation and transparent information sharing, the development of mutually rewarding partnerships between tribes and museums are possible and extend well into the future. Being receptive to tribal requests to provide more culturally appropriate collections management policies is one of the easiest ways to embrace input that is received during consultations. How collections are stored, accessed, researched, and cared for are primary concerns for descendant communities, and efforts should be made to accommodate reasonable requests. Not every request can be met, and in some cases, conflicting requests can be made by different tribal nations. Without going into too great a detail, some of the collections management requests that we've received have included keeping a light on or over burials at all times, storing funerary objects with or near associated burials wherever possible, posting proper signage outside and throughout the collections that notify visitors that human remains are present and that appropriate respect should be given, covering shelving units that store human remains with unbleached white muslin to not only denote their location within the collections, but also to provide privacy for the individuals there. And wherever possible, storing human remains in paper rather than plastic bags, because plastic is an unfamiliar material to the ancestor of descendant communities. In addition to implementing collection management requests, we have also composed NAGPRA guidelines that have been collaboratively developed through consultation with the museum's tribal partners, of which today we have about 14 that we've met with in face-to-face consultation meetings. These guidelines represent the museum's commitment to be sensitive and responsive to tribal concerns regarding the exposure, storage, use, and research into Native American human remains and NAGPRA objects within the museum's collections. This is meant to be a fluid document that may be modified or added to during future consultations. It also outlines policies and procedures for a number of unexpected circumstances that the museum's archaeology department may become involved. These include inadvertent discoveries, salvage recovery of human remains, responding to illegal excavation or looting of Native American burial sites, and future acquisition of NAGPRA items and human remains for eventual repatriation through the NAGPRA process. Cincinnati Museum Center and its predecessors do not have a strong history of presenting a holistic representation of Native American history and culture in Ohio. In the past, museum exhibitions and programming have been somewhat ethnocentric and have presented Native American people as stagnant and disappearing from the chronological sequence during the early historic period. Additionally, Native American human remains, funerary objects, and sacred items were included in natural history exhibits without considering how display of these items affects descendant communities and the general public's perception of Ohio's history and prehistory. You might also be aware that we've recently completed a major restoration of Union Terminal and that we're currently redeveloping all of our archaeology and historical exhibitions. This is really a unique, once-in-a-generation opportunity to reconsider exhibition content and take a more inclusive approach by collaborating with our tribal partners in developing these exhibits. Although these exhibitions are in the early concept and design stages, and they likely won't be completed for several years, we're committed to giving a voice to tribal nations with historic, geographic, and cultural connections to Ohio. And this is a fantastic example of how relationships with tribal communities can go beyond NAGPRA, as we are both stakeholders in Ohio and each have responsibility to accurately represent our shared histories through exhibition and education. That is why we invite all of our tribal partners to be involved in the development of CMC's archaeology exhibits, as this is not only an opportunity to facilitate tribal reconnections to ancestral lands, but it's also a chance to explore how tribal interests intersect with the museum's educational, historical, and preservational policies. Due to the legacy of 19th century Indian removal, there's a noticeable absence of federally recognized Native people in Ohio. When issues arise that require representation of tribal interests, this can become problematic because logistic details can preclude timely responses and appropriate representation. This is especially true for the protection of archaeological resources, which are continually damaged by agricultural activities, urban development, natural processes, and of course, looting. Recently, Museum Center archaeology personnel have assisted in two unfortunate situations. In each of these situations, the destruction of archaeological deposits and the exposure of human remains were noted. We acted on behalf of our tribal partners to ensure that their concerns and interests were represented. In the first instance, human remains were inadvertently discovered by contractors working for Duke Energy as part of a residential gas utility improvement project in Newtown, Ohio. Thankfully, the contractors recognized that they had encountered human remains while operating heavy equipment and ceased excavation activities immediately. They promptly notified the Newtown Police Department, who in turn contacted us to provide guidance because the area had long been known to contain sensitive archaeological material. We quickly arrived on scene and confirmed the presence of human remains. Fortunately, we were prepared for the situation as we had drafted our NAGPRA guidelines only a few months prior. As such, systems were in place to notify appropriate parties, including all of our tribal partners, the Hamilton County Coroner's Office, as well as the State Historic Preservation Office. Because we were able to delay construction activities and confer with our tribal partners, we were able to ensure that tribal interests were represented and that mitigation efforts were conducted with their approval and without press coverage or photography of human remains. These remains have formerly been deposited at the Museum Center and are presently in the NAGPRA system for future repatriation. In the second instance, I was leading a tour of archaeological sites in the lower Little Miami River Valley and for representatives of the Seneca Nation of Indians. While visiting a site in Anderson Township, we immediately discovered a looter's trench that measured 7 meters in length and nearly 4 meters in width. It had a maximum depth of almost 50 centimeters. This looting was extensive and was determined to have occurred unchecked over the late winter months of early 2019. At this time, we did not have organized procedures in place to report looting other than to notify the landowners, the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office, and the State Historic Preservation Office. However, because tribal representatives were present, we were able to develop procedures according to their wishes and mitigate the looting appropriately. We systematically documented the looter's trench and impacted archaeological deposits, as well as filed a formal report with the Preservation Office. This report was then distributed to several Ohio legislators to reinforce that Ohio's burial laws are inadequate, as current legislation would only prosecute this offense as destruction of public property. We also reburied all disturbed human remains on site and educated local sheriff's deputies who patrol the area about NAGPRA and local archaeological sites so that they could be better aware of suspicious activity in the future. NAGPRA is not just about deaccessioning collections and dwelling on what may be potentially lost. The long-term relationships with the communities whose histories are tied to the land that our organization commemorates are far more rewarding. Relationships with tribes are built slowly through personal engagement, requiring personal investment in the relationship and exploring the needs and goals of all parties. There are multiple pathways that can be taken towards establishing trust and initiating a new relationship. Engaging in a dialogue outside of NAGPRA with tribal representatives regarding questions that they may have about their past and what research they may benefit from in their homelands can be a strong step towards building a mutually beneficial relationship that will both advance knowledge of the past and facilitate the relationships necessary for successful and amicable execution of NAGPRA. Thank you. So that's it. Does anybody have any questions?
Tyler, I do. This is Bob Genner. I'm the curator of archaeology at the Cincinnati Museum Center. I was wondering if you wanted to talk briefly about issues in determining descendant communities, because it's a real problem in the Midwest and other parts of the United States, considering all of those communities were, all those folks were moved out. Could you discuss that briefly?
Sure. Yeah, it's very difficult in the Middle Ohio River Valley in particular. In kind of a very brief explanation, the problem arises because there's kind of a donut hole effect or a vacuum effect. This is one of the last areas in the Midwest where Euro-American contact occurs. Also, early contact in this region did not emphasize or prioritize any type of ethnographic documentation. So a lot of the identification and associations of cultures that may be affiliated to the archaeological reference cultures, such as Fort Ancient, Hopewell, Adena, Glacial Cave, all of these are archaeological constructs. We have to use material culture to make associations to them. It's a little bit complicated too, in that in Ohio, consultations in tribes with historic and geographic connections to the state were established by the 1795 Treaty of Greenville. There, I think, were 9 tribes that signed the 1795 Treaty of Greenville, which have warped today into 46 or 47 different federally recognized entities. And this doesn't include tribes like the Seneca Nation of Indians or any of the Iroquois Confederacy, known as the Haudenosaunee, in New York State. So because of where we're located, as at a nexus of transportation routes, obviously lots of rivers, there's also a lot of migrations and movements through the region. So we know that there are a lot of people who have connections to this location, and they can be kind of simplified as language groups, which would include Algonquian, such as the Shawnee, the Miami, the Delaware, Siouan, primarily Daguian Siouan, which is kind of an Eastern Siouan, so, where ethnohistorically we're around the St. Louis area. And this would include tribes like the Osage, the Quapaw, the Ponca, and the Omaha, as well as the Kansa. And then Iroquoian, which includes the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Tuscarora to a more limited extent, because they move up into the area a little bit later, but also groups like potentially the Susquehannock and such in Pennsylvania. So there are a lot of sites in the Ohio River Valley that have very multi-ethnic connections, which means that a lot of additional consultations are required. And of course, too, there are tribes that were in this area that are no longer in existence. And this would include tribes like the Massapequa and the Ofo, who were among the first ones documented in the eastern part of the state, but nobody is quite sure what happened to them.
So how much of this information on who you consult with is based on actually talking to the tribal partners versus doing ethnohistoric or archaeological research?
Well, it's both. We will consult with any tribes that are referred to us by our tribal partners because we want to be as inclusive and holistic as possible. We recognize that there are probably a lot of multi-ethnic connections to many of these sites, and we view consultation as an opportunity to learn more about our collections and to learn more about the prehistory of the region from which our collections originated. So it's very, very important for us in our consultation meetings to ask questions about what other tribes might have potential affiliations. And there are a lot of different ways to support this evidence, including traditional oral stories, oral histories. There are sometimes variations in material culture that are specifically associated with certain groups, particularly pottery. Pottery is a very, very good indicator of movements and migrations throughout the region. But of course, there's other things too. It's always difficult in archaeology because the only things that survive are the things that are durable. And the things that are durable don't necessarily have symbolism or emblems of nationality or political affinity.
Hi there, my name is Andrea Dennis and I'm in Ripley, Ohio. I live in Chicago and I'm quarantining here, and I'm from Ohio. And I really appreciated what you said, Tyler, about how the portrayal of Native Americans was stagnant, because I remember growing up thinking there are no more Native Americans in the education that I received. And I'm curious, where are there organizing educational bodies or associations in Ohio that are trying to recreate education and curriculum around Ohio tribes? Is one question. And the other question is, what resources would you recommend for understanding Native American tribes in Ohio? I've been to Fort Ancient and Serpent Mound and things like that, so I'm just curious.
Well, I'm most familiar with the southwestern portion of Ohio, and one of our important community partners is the Greater Cincinnati Native American Coalition. They are developing a lot of education programming. One of the main goals for their education initiatives is to portray a Native perspective in the educational component of the region. Obviously, history is generally written by the conquerors or whoever's in control of a particular location. So overturning that kind of the colonial aspect is really difficult. And in most textbooks, you get that same general narrative of disappearing from the sequence. Well, there are Native people all around us. They're no different than you and I. The difficult part is parsing out the misinformation that we received in the past. And to be completely honest too, when the early American history textbooks were being written, there were campaigns to keep that information out of the textbooks, the Native histories out of the textbooks, the people who actually helped us as the United States to separate from Britain. There were campaigns to completely limit and avoid that information so that it could justify the removal of tribes in the Midwest in the middle of the 19th century. What was the second part of your question?
Is there a book that you could recommend?
Yeah, there are a couple of really good books that are particularly useful. This Land Was Their Land is a textbook that I used in college. It's kind of an introduction to Native histories. It's all over the United States and it focuses on several different cultural areas. The Greater Cincinnati Native American Coalition would be a great place to take a look too. The Smithsonian Institution has been developing like classroom lesson plans for different ages that are STEM based and also present a more Native perspective. There's really quite a few of them out there. I know there's a couple of like coffee table type books that have come out in the recent past that have a much more Native perspective, but I'm drawing a blank on the title of that one as I'm trying to recall it, unfortunately.
Okay, and then actually one more. I visited the John Rankin House, which is a popular underground railroad spot, and I was sitting there meditating, and the guy who cuts the grass said that there's a lot of Native American burials on that hill. And is there something that should be done with that? Should I, or just accept what he said?
I mean, Native Americans have lived in North and South America for at minimum 14,000 years, probably much longer than that, to be honest. There are thousands upon thousands of Native American grave sites all throughout Ohio. The overwhelming majority of them are unmarked, and the best way to preserve them is to protect them and make sure that they are known amongst the community in many ways. There's really two ideas behind this, actually. One is to kind of hide in plain sight without labeling or marking where these things are located. And the other one is to put up signage. And there's a disagreement amongst the archaeological community as well as the Native American community about which way works better. In certain instances, I think that signage is very, very important, especially in areas where there is a significant public presence, because in an area where there's a significant public presence, you have the community who could act as kind of like citizen scientists or first reporters, people who can point out information and share that with the proper the proper jurisdictions and proper enforcement. But in areas where that's not the case, I think it's pretty important to keep those locations under wraps, because there's only so many archaeologists out there, and we can't be everywhere all at one time. And same with indigenous people. It's really difficult to protect them in many cases. And in what was it, about 1914, there was a map of Ohio that marks around 10,000 or so mounds just in Ohio alone on a county by county basis. So a lot of that information's out there. It's just how people use it, which can become problematic. I follow a lot of Facebook groups that are artifact collector groups, and I'm constantly shocked and amazed at some of the things that I see on there. And I've done a lot of reporting to officials about what I do see, but each state has its own set of laws, which complicates things too. For archaeological protection, there aren't a lot of teeth in a lot of the archaeological legislation, unfortunately. Although NAGPRA went a very long way for establishing some of the sanctions that would affect NAGPRA items in archaeological sites, there aren't a whole lot of them that have been prosecuted, unfortunately, though.
Well, thanks so much for your work in this, and I really appreciate this presentation.
Sure, I'm glad I could do it. Anybody else? Well, everyone, thank you for participating and joining the...
Oh, sorry. Hi, Tyler. This is Sarah Glass with National NAGPRA. I just wanted to say hi, and
hi,
thanks
Sarah.
for a great presentation. Sorry I jumped on late.
Well, thank you for joining. How are
Thank you,
things at
Tyler.
National NAGPRA?
Say that again?
I said, how are things at National NAGPRA?
Oh, hanging in there. A little crazy as always, but we're hanging in. So, great. Yeah, whole world is right now, it seems. But the good work continues. So thanks for this.
Well, I'm happy to do it. I'm glad I had an opportunity to do so, and I'm sure I'll be in contact with you in the fairly near future.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks again, everyone. Have a great
afternoon. Thank you, Tyler.
Bye-bye.
Bye.